Yes, what I want to talk about this morning is some aspects of meaning, especially word meaning, and emphasizing the sort of open-endedness of word meaning. Again, I'll start with some traditional, well, again for Western linguistics, traditional ideas, and then present the cognitive linguistic view, which is opposed to these other traditional ideas. Now, a common view in linguistics is that you need to make a distinction between knowing a language and other things that you know. For example, so the distinction between knowledge of a language and knowledge of the world around you. This is often expressed in terms of the dictionary versus the encyclopedia. So the dictionary is one kind of book. The encyclopedia is another kind of book. The dictionary gives you words and their meanings. The encyclopedia gives you all sorts of scientific, cultural, historical information about things. Now, this distinction seems reasonable and quite, common sense, so to speak. And if you take bananas, for example, a very simple example, what is the fact that bananas are yellow, or rather that ripe bananas are yellow, is this part of the meaning of the word banana, or is it something that you happen to know about bananas because you are familiar with them? It would seem sort of common sense to say that, well, the fact that they happen to be yellow or green or whatever is part of encyclopedic knowledge, is not part of the meaning of the word. And it would seem absurd to say that everything you know about something or a kind of thing or whatever is part of your encyclopedic knowledge of language. If you happen to be a botanist or a zoologist, you know lots of things about plants and animals which other people perhaps don't know. This is clearly your encyclopedic knowledge. It's not part of your knowledge of the language. Okay? So if you are a scientist studying plants and animals, that doesn't really change your dictionary understanding of the names of plants and animals and so on. Now, the idea that there could be linguistic knowledge, separate and distinct from encyclopedic knowledge, this is an aspect of a topic that I mentioned at the very beginning, namely an aspect of the Chomskyan view of the modularity of cognition. Namely that there is little one component of the mind which concerns linguistic ability and other components which concern your encyclopedic, your scientific, your historical, your cultural knowledge. And not surprisingly, cognitive linguistics is opposed to this and proposes that linguistic knowledge is basically encyclopedic. It is open-ended, that there is no basis for a clean distinction between knowing a word and knowing about what the word refers to. But to keep to this distinction, the distinction between the dictionary and the encyclopedia is, of course, the basis for what we have discussed already, the distinction between analytic and synthetic sentences. Remember, an analytic sentence is a sentence which is true because of the linguistic meaning of the words. Okay? So you would say, this square has 4 sides. It's true. It's got to be true because of the encyclopedic, because of the dictionary definition of square. A square is a thing with 4 sides. That's the definition. That's the linguistic meaning of the word. Therefore, to say this square has 4 sides has got to be true. So it's necessarily true because of the meaning of square, also because of the meaning of side, actually, and of 4, and of have, right? So because of the meanings of the words, the sentence has to be true. Another way of saying that, in fact, is that the sentence, in fact, is uninformative. It doesn't actually tell you anything that you don't already know. Okay, and a word used to describe something which actually tells you nothing, it is a tautology is a statement which, in fact, says nothing. It simply says, it gives you no information that you don't already have. So the square has four sides is analytic, necessarily true in virtue of the meanings of the words. However, if you say this square is yellow, then that is informative, because you're telling something about the square. And it may be true or it may be false, depending on whether the square is indeed yellow or not. Right? So that sentence is actually informative. It can be true or false, depending not on the meanings of the words, but on how the world is, on whether the square is indeed yellow or not. So it's true or false with reference to something outside of language itself. So this, as I say, seems self-evident. It's obvious. Another aspect of this, of the idea that there is such a thing as pure linguistic knowledge, it gives you the notion of the entailment. I think we've had entailments before. An entailment is a kind of logical consequence. So if this sentence is true, then this sentence must be true. So if you say this is a square, this entails, well, this has four sides. So whatever this refers to. So that is a logical entailment. If the first sentence is true, the second must be true. Okay? Notice, of course, that the entailment doesn't go the other way. If you say this has four sides, this does not entail that it is a square. Right? It could be a sort of... and also, if you say this is not a square, well, it could still have four sides. So the entailment is a very clearly defined relation. If this is true, then that must be true. It doesn't work the other way around. And it doesn't work if it's negated. And to take another example, he is a bachelor. This man is a bachelor, entails he is not married. That is necessarily true. It's a logical entailment because of how you define the word bachelor as an unmarried man. And other examples would be, John is taller than Mary, entails Mary is shorter than John. So tall and short would be, converses. A is taller than B, B is shorter than A, necessarily, because of the meaning of tall and short. Right? And likewise, if I say I used to live in Auckland, this entails that at some time in the past I did live in Auckland. And I used to do it entails that I did do it. Okay? So that is true, if you like, necessarily true because of the meaning of this used to form. Etc. Hundreds of examples. Now, I say this is all common sense. This is all common sense, you might think. But there are, as usual, problems. I've dealt with very clear-cut examples, very clear examples, prototypical examples, if you like, or representative examples, good examples of the notion of analytic sentences and the notion of purely linguistic knowledge. But there are problems, as always. First of all, the analytic-synthetic distinction is not always absolutely clear-cut. I think I mentioned this briefly yesterday afternoon in response to a question. it's not always entirely clear-cut. Neither is the status of entailments as logically necessary always clear. To give an example, which again I mentioned yesterday briefly, the word mammal as a kind of creature, kind of animal. So mammals would include, well, humans, cats, dogs, horses, cows, pigs, etc. Okay, thank you. I remember when I did sort of biology school, mammals were defined as creatures which give birth to live young. Right? They give birth to live young, as opposed to birds, which of course give birth to, well, lay eggs. Right? So you might think, well, mammal entails, if this creature is a mammal, therefore it gives birth to live young. Right? But then there is the case which I mentioned yesterday, the problematic case of the Australian creature called the platypus. And I think someone, what is the translation of that? Platypus? That the Australian creature, this big, covered with fur, with a beak and webbed feet. Okay, you know what I mean? Okay. Okay, well, the thing with the platypus, it actually lays an egg. So therefore you might think, well, it's got to be a bird. But on the other hand, I think the scientific classification of it nowadays is as a kind of mammal. And in fact, I think the young platypus feeds itself on milk from the mother. Right? So it's a strange creature, a very strange creature. It has features of birds, it has features of mammals, but the scientific classification nowadays, I think, is as an egg-laying mammal, of which there are very few, of course. And I can perhaps repeat the story I mentioned yesterday, that when the European explorers in Australia first came across this creature in the sort of late 18th century, they got some specimens and sent them back to the museums, the natural history museums in Europe, in London and Paris. And when these things arrived, people thought that it has got to be a joke. Such a creature could not exist, it was thought, when they dissected them and examined them. And they thought that maybe these people in Australia, they'd had some kind of joke. They had simply taken pieces from different parts of animals and stitched them together. Because the animal did not, in fact, fit into any of the established categories. Now, this actually is of an example that mammal, well, we can say it used to entail giving birth to live young, but then this piece of knowledge, this logical entailment was then modified on the basis of scientific discoveries, scientific advances. And here are a couple of others. A cat is an animal. Well, you might say yes. But the philosopher Putnam actually played one of those games that philosophers play and say, well, suppose in the future scientists discover that cats are not, in fact, what we thought they were. They were sort of robots controlled from creatures in outer space. So what seems to be a self-evident analytic truth would then actually become false. And a sentence like, my father is a woman, would seem to be a contradiction. Well, it used to be a contradiction, until, of course, the people start having sex change operations, in which case it now can be true. So, my father is a woman, you might think that is necessarily false because of the meanings of the words, but in fact, scientific and medical advances can actually make it true. So even in this case, even the distinction male-female you might think is pretty basic, even that actually becomes a matter of encyclopedic knowledge, and it undermines the notion of the analytic synthetic. 2 plus 3 equals 5. I mean, what could be more analytic than that? That's how you define the numbers. But, of course, you can think of cases where 2 plus 3 do not equal 5. For example, I have 2 of these things. That's your 2. You have 3. 1, 2, 3. And, of course, there are only 4 of them. The point is, if you say 2 plus 3 equals 5, you presuppose that they are different and separate entities. But if you're counting up what you have and what I have, of course, we can share things. So just in case one thing is a member of both sets, then of course, it becomes 4. Now, the point about that, of course, is that 2 plus 3 equals 5 is understood as being true only against certain assumptions. Okay? You assume that the 2 entities and the 3 entities are different. Right? There are 2 sets of entities, a set of 2 and a set of 3, and together they give you a big set of 5. You do not allow the possibility that the sets intersect, overlap. Okay. Okay. Now, here are some more observations on the synthetic analytic or encyclopedic linguistic distinction, which would suggest that there is really no basis for drawing the distinction. The distinction is a fuzzy one. I mentioned, well, the first reason for putting in question the linguistic, the dictionary encyclopedia distinction is that it's difficult to draw the line. Okay? It's difficult to draw the line. But actually that in itself is not a reason for abandoning the distinction. I mean, many distinctions are fuzzy, but that doesn't mean that you don't make them. Right? More important, I think, is the fact that you need to refer to encyclopedic knowledge in order to account for how language is used, right? In order to account for what is meaningful and even what is grammatical. So how words are used often invokes, sorry, there should be an S on the end of that, often invokes encyclopedic notions. There should be an S on the end of that. For example, if you take the word bunch, you have a bunch of bananas is a normal collocation. Collocation is the word, how words go together, right? So a bunch of bananas is an acceptable collocation. But a sprig of bananas is not. A sprig is a little sort of shoot, a little branch. You have a sprig of parsley, a herb. And the reason for that, clearly, is that the word bunch refers to the way in which things are collected together. And bananas, well, you can say a bunch of bananas because of the way bananas grow, because the way they sort of grow on a, right? They grow in bunches. Right? So the acceptability of that collocation, you accept that collocation because you know how bananas look like when they grow or when you buy them in a bunch. And you reject a sprig of bananas because they are not the right shape. So the shape of the things, how they grow, is a piece of information which determines the acceptability of this collocation. And how things grow, what they look like, is, I suppose, is that encyclopedic or linguistic? Well, because it determines language use, you would have to say it's linguistic. So you see that the notion of the linguistic is sort of spreading. It includes how things grow, their shape, and so on. Other points here, how and whether, how complex expressions, that is, expressions consisting of more than one word, how these expressions are interpreted often depends on encyclopedic knowledge, and I'll give examples of that in a moment. Okay. And the third point is that, interesting point is that what seems to be encyclopedic knowledge can actually influence the way word meanings change. So, language history. And the fourth point, which I'll develop this morning, is that if you want to define or describe word meanings, you nearly always need to refer to broad encyclopedic knowledge as represented in the notions of domains, scripts, cognitive models, and so on. So I'll be talking about domains and scripts and cognitive models later. Okay. So the point, second point there, how complex expressions are interpreted, and indeed whether they are interpreted, whether you can interpret them, whether you can give a meaning to something, very often depends on what you know about the world around you. An example of this would be, a very simple example, the way in which an adjective combines with a noun, an adjective-noun expression. Now, the combination of adjective plus noun, as for example a red house, looks pretty simple, no problem there. And the account that is given of that normally is that, that is the set of things that are houses. Okay, a bit of set theory here. That is the set of things that are houses. Anything that is a house is there. That is the set of things that are red. And red houses are things that are both houses and that are red. Okay? Pretty obvious. But if you think about it, even this very, very simple example is actually a bit problematic. If a house is red, does that mean that... what is red if a house is red? All of the house, right, is the is the kitchen sink red? Probably not. The red house, it would be a house which is painted red on the outside, but not all of it. The windows would be not painted red. I mean the glass, right? They would be left unpainted. So you'd understand a red house not as a house which is completely red inside and outside all over, right? Your knowledge of what houses are would influence the way in which you interpret that. You would know which bits of the house are going to be red. Typically, it would be the outside walls. The roof, well, maybe not. The window, the glass in the windows, certainly not. The door, well, maybe not. But you could also, in fact, think of other interpretations. Suppose you had visited a number of houses and you wanted to refer to these houses to your partner, and you actually want a descriptive phrase, a phrase to describe one of the houses that you have been to, and you remember that one of these houses that you've been to had a very noticeable red bathroom or something. You could refer to that in later as simply the red house, because red was a prominent color of some part of the house. What I'm saying, in fact, is that red house, although it looks pretty straightforward, the way you interpret that depends on your knowledge of houses and what you notice about them and so on and so forth. Of course, you could have red house referring to a house that was red in the inside. The inside walls were painted red. The outside was normal. So how you interpret that actually depends on what you know about houses. An example of this, which has often been discussed, is the way in which the adjective good is used. Well, if you say a good knife, that doesn't work. You can't say a good knife, okay, is a knife, now, belongs to the things that are knives and all the things that are good. Right? So you can't sort of replace that by and say that good knives are things that are both good things and knives. Because a good knife is not simply a knife that is good. It is a knife that is good for something. And what is a good knife good for? Well, what are knives for? Knives are for cutting things. So a good knife would be one with a sharp blade that stays sharp, that does what you use a knife for. So the expression a good knife would refer to what knives are for, what you typically do with them. Typically do with them. Because you could perhaps imagine situations in which a good knife might mean something else. And a good film, of course, has a rather different interpretation. What are films for? What do you do with them? How might you evaluate a film as good or bad? Well, it's enjoyable, right? Good entertainment. Or it could be very well made, very artistic, very informative, makes you laugh, or whatever. Your criteria for evaluating it could change. So what is a good film for me might not be a good film for you. Right? And good students, well, can mean different things for different people, I suppose. So in order to interpret these things, you take the word knife, or whatever, and then good means that you've got to evaluate the thing. Is it good or not good with respect to something? And how you interpret it actually depends on your encyclopedic knowledge of the thing. Now, if you take an expression like a good mountain, that's an expression which I would find difficult to interpret because there's no obvious way of interpreting it. Because mountains are not things that you normally use for anything. It's not obvious what it means. And if you try to interpret it, well, think for a moment how you would interpret that. What would it mean? Well, what you have to do, you have to think of some little activity, some scene in which involves mountains. And this activity or whatever can then be evaluated as good or not good. And that's how you would interpret good mountain. For example, how might you interpret it? Suppose you like drawing, making pictures, paintings of mountains. Well, that's a good one to photograph. That's a good one to paint. Suppose you... what else could you do with mountains? I don't know. Good mountain for climbing. If you climb mountains, well, this is a good one to climb. It's sort of challenging and difficult and so on. Okay, but the point is, good mountain is not a standard collocation. Whereas, of course, good knife is a fairly standard expression. Good mountain is not a standard expression. It's an unusual collocation. And here, it's the second point, how and whether you can interpret the expression. If you cannot think of a little story involving, mountains, if you can't think of the appropriate story, then good mountain would simply be a meaningless expression. Now, the other thing I mentioned here, number 3, the encyclopedic information can influence semantic change and meaning extension. Do you know do you know the history of the word bead? A bead, those are things that you have around your neck, little things. Okay. Okay. Anybody wearing beads? So we see what they are. Right? Anyway, you all know what beads are. Okay. Do you know the history of this word? Do you know the history of this word? Can someone shout out the translation of bead? Okay. Okay. You wear them. You wear them round your neck. Little things. Okay. Oh, on a string with beads. Okay. Now this is an example. Have you done the history of this word? Anybody mentioned? No. It's an example which is very often quoted if you do the history of English or the history of semantic change. It's a very nice example. In Old English or Middle English, the word bead, or I think bedis as it was pronounced, the word bead did not mean bead, it meant prayer. So, a prayer you pray to God, it meant a prayer. So bead meant prayer. Or rather, the word in Middle English meant prayer, but in modern English it means, of course, so it used to mean prayer, and now it means bead. Now, how on earth can a word change its meaning from a prayer, you pray to God, to a bead? Well, that seems a pretty strange way for a word to change its meaning. The answer to this, of course, has to do with certain religious practices. Again, these are very, culture-specific and historical. The fact is that in Roman Catholic religion, you are supposed to say, you are required to say prayers and to repeat your prayer a certain number of times, especially if you are invoking God. So you've got to say your prayer a certain number of times. So you've got to say your prayer 10 times or 20 times or whatever. So how do you keep count of the number of prayer? How do you keep count of the number of times you say the prayer? Well, you have a piece of string, and you have little balls on the string, and then you say the prayer once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, right? So you count the number of times you said the prayer on this piece of string with these little balls on it. So given this cultural activity, this practice, you can see how the idea of counting your prayers, counting how many times you say the prayer, is actually the same thing as counting the number of beads on your piece of string. Right? As you count the prayers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you are counting the beads on your string. Okay? And you can imagine how the change in meaning would come about. So somebody is there saying prayers and counting the beads, and you would say, look at that person. He is counting his beads, meaning prayers, but that might then be interpreted as, look at him, he's counting the beads. So because of this activity, the word was then able to go, its meaning was able to shift from, say, prayer to bead. And, if you look at this sort of from the outside, you would think, well, prayers and beads, there's absolutely no connection. But the connection is established by means of the encyclopedic knowledge, the historical, cultural knowledge about this religious practice. Okay? So that is a case where cultural encyclopedic facts have an influence on language, and influence, in this case, the way in which the meaning of the word has changed. Another example, actually, of a similar thing is, well, the word tobacco. Now, tobacco entered, I think, well, tobacco comes from, I think, Central South America. It's indigenous to South America. And the English word tobacco comes from an American Indian word, which meant not tobacco, it meant pipe. So I think tobac, the original meaning in the American Indian language was pipe. Now you can see how a word for pipe could mean tobacco. So if you see somebody smoking, or you pass the pipe around to someone, well, you pass the tobacco around to someone. So because of the practice of smoking tobacco in a pipe, you can see how the word for pipe could be used for the substance. Okay, and to come back to the third example, come back to bananas, we have in English the expression a banana republic. Do you know the expression a banana republic? Okay, it's used to refer to a country which has a very poor economy, which is bankrupt, corrupt, usually small country, a hopeless country. What's it got to do with bananas? Well, a banana republic does not necessarily have to grow bananas. But the expression banana republic derives from the fact that some countries in Central America, their only economic activity basically is growing bananas. So a small country with only one activity, and these countries, well, they may or may not have been poor and backward. But the expression banana republic has come to be used, as I say, small countries with very, very poor, very inefficient economies. And the expression's probably, well, encyclopedic knowledge, if you like, about bananas and the economy of bananas and the economy of countries which grow bananas. We had cash cow before, didn't we? I think we mentioned that expression, a cash cow. Again, this is based on your knowledge about cows. You have a cow and you get an endless supply of milk. Converts grass into milk. Sorry, this chalk is getting into my throat. Okay, so as a cow converts a useless substance like grass into a useful substance like milk. So to have a cow is to have a source of income for nothing, so to speak. And that then is used by extension to refer to any sort of business enterprise you have, which gives you lots of income for very little input. And that idiomatic expression is based, to say, on your knowledge of cows. And, Okay, so coming back here, so word meanings can be characterized against encyclopedic knowledge as captured in terms of domains, scripts, frames, etc. This is now what I want to come to. We've talked about this in sort of very sort of general terms. Let's get a bit more specific. How you actually define some word meanings. Do you know what a hypotenuse is? It's a term of geometry. If you have a triangle, okay? A triangle with a right angle. That is the hypotenuse, okay? Whatever. Okay, so, so what is a hypotenuse? Well, now you know. The point is, what is a hypotenuse? Well, there are two ways of answering that question. One way is to say a hypotenuse is a straight line. It's a straight line. Because, well, that's what it is. It is a straight line. However, it is a straight line which is part of something else. It is part of a right-angled triangle, specifically the side which is opposite the right angle. Now, the point about this example is that in order to understand what a hypotenuse is, you first of all got to know what a right-angled triangle is. Right? If you didn't know some basic geometry, you wouldn't know what a hypotenuse is. Now, the terms which Lannacher has used to describe this relation here, we would say that the word hypotenuse profiles or highlights one aspect, one component of the notion of a triangle. And the notion of the triangle is the base against which the word profiles. Okay? Or to put it another way, the notion of a triangle is, as it were, contained in the notion of a hypotenuse. But the word hypotenuse does not refer to the triangle. It refers to the straight line. But the straight line has got to be understood against the knowledge of the triangle. Okay? And there are many, many examples of that. If I take the English word thumb, thumb is understood, this is a thumb, okay? That's what the word refers to, what it profiles. But thumb is understood against the notion of a hand. In contrast to the word toe, okay? Well, thumb and, well, finger are understood as these things which are part of the human hand, whereas toe, of course, is the equivalent things on the foot. In fact, in English, there is no special word for the big toe. Or in fact, you have to say big toe. Right? So thumb is for the hand, and the thing you have on your feet is referred to as your big toe. There is no special word for that one. Okay, but the distinction, okay, so English makes the distinction between the things on the hands and things on the feet. Okay? But the point is the word thumb. To understand the word thumb, well, you can imagine a similar kind of diagram. The word thumb profiles this thing, but against the notion of the human hand. So the notion of the human hand is, as it were, contained in the notion of a thumb. Okay? Typically attached, but you can actually have your thumb chopped off. But still, even if the thumb has been chopped off or severed, it's still understood as with reference to the hand. And of course you can go further. The hand as part of the arm as part of the whole body. So the idea would be then that to understand these words, you've actually got to have some background knowledge, actually, of the in the case of, say, hypotenuse. Okay, in the case of hypotenuse, it is clearly a part of a whole. Likewise with thumb, it's a part of a whole. And basically, okay, to anticipate, in cognitive linguistics, it's basically stated that every expression profiles something or other against some sort of background. Okay, let's look at a few other cases which are fairly straightforward. The notion of an island. Well, an island is simply, well, a mass of land, but there's got to be water around it. Right? So an island is a mass of land surrounded by water. Okay? So the word island refers to, profiles the land. It does not refer to the water. Right? But unless there is water, there's no island. So again, now you can draw a similar kind of thing. That is what the word profiles, that is the land. But then you've got to have the water around it. Otherwise, it isn't an island. As opposed to a peninsula which is like this, except that it's sort of a mass of land which is connected to a larger land mass by means of a narrow piece of land. Again, peninsula refers to this. Sorry, that's wrong color. That should be white as well. So, the peninsula refers to a kind of strip of land, smallish, which is connected to a large land mass, otherwise surrounded by water. But peninsula refers simply to this piece of, sorry, let's reread, simply refers to that sort of piece of land, but the larger land mass and the water is not profiled. Okay. If you take another example, a little more complex, kinship words, something like uncle. Well, uncle, what does uncle profile? What does it designate? Well, it profiles a male human being, basically. That's what it refers to, a man, or could be a boy. The word uncle refers to a male human. That's all it refers to. But that human, that man, boy, is understood to be in a certain kind of relation to somebody else. Me, or indeed somebody else. Namely, it's a specific relation. The uncle is the brother of a parent, actually. Or perhaps even the uncle is the husband of the sister of a parent. Okay, hypotenuse, we've done that. So the hypotenuse profiles a straight line, understood as the side of a right-angled triangle, the one which is opposite the right angle. Now, the notion of the right-angled triangle is the base against which the notion of hypotenuse is understood. But notice, however, you can actually zoom out further. If you can only understand hypotenuse against the notion of a triangle, how do you understand the notion of a triangle? Well, you understand the notion of a triangle against your knowledge of geometry, the notion of shapes and figures and space. So ultimately, your notion of this stuff is based on your knowledge of space, shapes, geometrical figures, straight lines, angles, and so on. And if you come back to the word uncle, involves notions of kinship relations, as I say, the brother of a parent. But notions of brother and parent, and indeed the notion of kinship, is based on much wider knowledge, such as the notion of family, of gender, of procreation, of giving birth, and of, say, family relations, and so on and so forth. So, as you sort of look at the broader knowledge base, you find that even such a simple word like uncle, in fact, goes into quite a lot of aspects of general, indeed cultural knowledge. Now, that is the next point, in fact. Uncle is not just a kinship term. It doesn't just refer to somebody who is related to me by, through my parents and brother relation. The word uncle actually has other associations, namely it has to do with rights and responsibilities and friendship relations and so on. So there is a typical kind of relation between an uncle and the nephew and niece. So it has to do with, as I say, family relations, family dynamics and responsibilities and friendship affinities and so on. And in fact, in English, you can actually use the word uncle to refer to somebody who is in fact not related at all. So for young children, for example, there are the real uncles, but say a male friend of the family, a man who is a friend of the family, can be referred to for the children as Uncle Bob. Right? Even though the man is not actually the child's uncle, you can say to the child, no, Uncle Bob is coming tonight. I'll go and say hello to Uncle Bob. So uncle can be used in this extended sense to refer to, a male friend of the family, a friend of the parents who is then, friendly to a friend of the child. So even this very, very, very simple concept of uncle actually reaches into all sorts of aspects of general conceptual and cultural knowledge. And these aspects of very general cultural knowledge are often referred to as the domain. A domain is then any body of knowledge which provides the context for understanding an expression. Now, most concepts, in fact, are understood against many different domains. Take, for example, the notion of photograph. Photograph is a pretty, you might think, unproblematic word. But if you think about the notion of a photograph, you can see that to understand what photographs are, you've got to have knowledge of all sorts of different domains of experience. First of all, a photograph is a representation of something, right? It represents something. And this then gets you into the domain of representations. Well, there are different kinds of representations. You have photographs, you have pictures, you can tell a story. A story is a narrative, would be a representation of something. So the theory of representing something. Then a photograph, photographs haven't been around for ever. Photographs are based on a very special technology, which is actually based on a special technology, which is actually only about 150 years old, isn't it? So it's quite a recent invention. So photographs are based on a very special technology. So this gets you into the domain of technology and science and so on and so forth. Thirdly, photographs have to be made by somebody. Photographs don't just appear. They've got to be made by somebody, which gets you into the domain of people and their actions and their intentions. Right? Then, fourthly, photographs can actually be evaluated as good or not so good. They require skill. And indeed, some people are so good at this that they actually make their living this way. So you can have professional photographers. So this gets you into the domain of professions and skill and such things. Another point is that, especially more recently, again, this is a recent, very recent technological development, photographs can exist in various media. You can have photographs on paper and photographs in electronic form. Now, the idea of an electronic photograph, I mean, that's only been around for about 10 years. I mean, a very recent technological development. Then photographs can be, you can value a photograph because of its aesthetic, artistic quality. Then photographs are valued because they are, I think the sound is going again, as a record of your earlier life. Now, what's happening here? Which one is this? Right. So photographs can be valued because they are memories of your earlier life or episodes of your earlier life. And, of course, they can have administrative purposes, passport photographs, ID photographs, etc. Now, the point about this, so here you see all sorts of encyclopedic knowledge here, many different domains, the artistic, technological, personal, professional, and so on. Now, what's the point about this for linguistic purposes? Well, how you use the word photograph, well, different uses of the word photograph actually can draw on different domains. If you say this photograph is torn, this brings into focus a photograph as a piece of paper. Right? It's on a piece of paper. But this photograph is out of focus. The emphasis here, what you highlight is not the photograph as a piece of paper, but simply the quality of the image. Okay? And if you say a photograph of me, what you emphasize here is, of course, the photograph as a representation of somebody. Right? So a photograph of me is a photograph which depicts me. And a good photograph of me is one that depicts me in a flattering way. Notice, actually, a photograph of me means a photograph which represents me, whereas my photograph can mean different things. My photograph could be, okay, a photograph of me, or it could be a photograph that I possess, or it could be a photograph that I made. But a photograph of me is a photograph which represents me. Okay? And notice, in fact, that you cannot say a car of me in the sense of my car, just as a photograph of me cannot mean a photograph which belongs to me. Then his photograph appeared in all the newspapers. Well, here the photograph is not just a single piece of paper with the image, but it's the image itself which can be reproduced in a very large number of versions. Email me the photograph. Well, say 20 years ago that wouldn't have made sense. It's only possible because of the technology of electronic documents and so on. Now, one question actually arises here. Because in these 6 sentences or whatever, using the word photograph, which should highlight different aspects of they highlight different domains against which you understand photographs. One question of interest would be, does the word photograph mean different things in those 6 sentences? Does it mean something different? In other words, is the word photograph polysemous? Okay? That actually is a very difficult question, and I wouldn't want to say yes or no. It clearly refers to different. It refers to different things. The photograph is torn is a piece of paper. Email me the photograph. It's an electronic file. There are different kinds of things. So you might want to say, well, photograph has got to be polysemous because it refers to a piece of paper or an electronic file or a digital file. By the way, the question of polysemy, you know the question of polysemy, that is, a word has more than one meaning. The question is then, does the word photograph have different meanings? It's a very difficult question to answer, but notice if you try to combine two of these uses in a single sentence. I tore up the out-of-focus photograph. So tear up, this invokes a piece of paper, but out of focus invokes the quality of the image. So the digital photograph could also be out of focus, right? But notice if you combine two of these, I tore up the out of focus photograph, the result is perfectly normal. It's not at all unusual. It doesn't sound funny. Suggesting, in fact, that it's the same word with the same meaning, but it is different facets of the thing has been highlighted. Okay? Another example of this, actually, is the word safe. We'll come back to the adjective-noun combination. Now, safe looks a pretty straightforward word. What does it mean when you say something is safe? Well, my money is safe. A safe driver, a safe beach, a safe house, and a safe place. The point about safe is that safe invokes actually a rather interesting domain. The interesting sort of background situation. And if you use the word safe, you are appealing to a situation in which, first of all, there is something which is of some value to you. Okay? There's something of value, something which you want to keep. Secondly, there's a danger to this valued thing. And thirdly, there is a desire to avoid or to prevent the danger, to keep the valued thing away from the danger. So if you keep this little scene in mind, there's something of value, there's a threat, there's a danger to it, and you want to keep the danger away. These are then highlighted in different ways according to how you use the word safe. For example, if you say, how would you interpret a safe house? This house is safe. Well, there are two different ways you could interpret it, I think. If you are in a region which has lots of earthquakes, right? Earthquakes. You want to live in a house that is safe from earthquakes. In other words, in an earthquake area, a safe house would be one that protects you from the earthquake, which is not destroyed. So the house itself is a thing of value, and the house is such that it is not destroyed by the earthquake. Another use of safe house is a house in which you are safe. The house protects you from danger. Okay? And likewise, a safe beach. What is a safe beach? That would be a beach where you could go swimming without drowning. Right? So the thing of value is you. The danger is the sea and the possibility of drowning. And the beach is such that it protects you from this danger. Okay. So the different ways in which safe is used actually can draw on different aspects of this scenario here. Okay, the notion of domain is associated especially with Lanica. I just want to mention briefly a very similar notion that has been developed by a man called Pustejovsky, who is a computational computer linguist, is in connection with sort of the semantic representation of concepts. And a very similar notion, a notion rather similar to notion of domain has been developed by Pustejovsky. So the idea is that the understanding of a noun, a nominal concept, often draws on often involves four kinds of information. If you take, for example, I don't know, the notion of a chair, the concept of a chair, what it's made of, well, wood. How to identify it and its place in the broader taxonomy? Well, it has a seat, a back, certain shape. It's a kind of furniture. Thirdly, what is it for? Well, it's for sitting on. Fourthly, how did it come to exist? Well, somebody made it. It was manufactured. You didn't find it in nature. It was made. So these four kinds of information, he claimed, are important for understanding words, understanding nouns, and also for understanding how words are used. And again, if you look at the word book, okay, if you write a book, what does book refer to? It refers to the text. In other words, it is a text, right? If you translate the book, it is a text in a certain language. If you drop the book, it is a physical object, right? And if you burn the book, it's an object made of a combustible substance, paper. So different uses of the word book can actually highlight different aspects of the concepts, which is very similar to what I've been saying in connection with photographs. Now, what I want to mention next, actually, is another aspect of this, the way in which different uses of a word can draw on different aspects of encyclopedic knowledge. A nice illustration of this is the case of eponyms. You probably don't know what eponyms are, but eponyms are names, proper names, which are used in a sort of extended sense. Now, a proper name, like Shakespeare, refers basically to Shakespeare. A proper name is the name of a person. But names of persons can sometimes be used to refer to other things. Right? So, a proper name refers typically, prototypically, to a thing that's named. But you can use names to refer to other things. And these are eponyms. Take the word Shakespeare. A couple of examples of Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare refers to Shakespeare. Right? That's the name of the man. But you can say Cervantes was Spain's Shakespeare. Now, Cervantes was a Spanish writer, and say this writer was Spain's Shakespeare. Now, clearly, Shakespeare here does not mean William Shakespeare. How do you interpret that? Now, you probably don't know much about Cervantes. I don't either. But given that expression, Cervantes was Spain's Shakespeare, how would you interpret that? Think about it and think of how you work out what it means. I think what happens piece of chalk. Where's the chalk gone? Okay. So basically you have Shakespeare. Think for a moment of the words that are mentioned in the text. Shakespeare is mentioned. Spain is mentioned. You have a sort of analogy, right? What goes there? What goes in? What goes here? Well, so you set up a sort of analogy, and what is stated here, Cervantes is to Spain as Shakespeare was to England. So what does that tell you about Cervantes? That he was a major Spanish writer, playwright, you might suppose, but not necessarily. He was a major Spanish writer of the past. Now, how do you work that out? Because you know that Shakespeare was a major, perhaps the major English writer. Now, you interpret that because of what you know about Shakespeare. Now, which is a sort of encyclopedic knowledge. Now, some people would say that names like Shakespeare do not actually mean anything. They simply refer. But I think it's also true that that names also invoke all the sort of encyclopedic knowledge you have about the individual. That you know that Shakespeare was a major English writer, therefore it's stated that Cervantes was a major Spanish writer. But now, suppose you say Cervantes might be a literary giant, but he's no Shakespeare. How do you interpret that one? And you interpret that in a different way, notice. Here, the analogy is actually being denied. Cervantes might be a literary giant, but he is no Shakespeare. This means that Shakespeare was special, he was above them all, kind of thing. Now, what about this one? Did Shakespeare write Shakespeare? Can you interpret that one? Well, as you may know, there's quite a, well, actually for quite a long time, there's been a lot of discussion about whether the historical person, William Shakespeare, actually was the author of what we now call Shakespeare's plays. So notice that Shakespeare is being used in two senses. Was Shakespeare the historical man, the historical individual? Was he the author of the plays that we know as the plays of Shakespeare? So there's a nice sort of, it looks like a contradiction. It looks like a tautology. Shakespeare, of course, was the author of Shakespeare's plays that's what the words mean. Here's another one, actually. These are borrowed from a student of mine who's doing some research on the use of eponyms. In fact, the use of names to refer to, not to refer to the individuals, is in fact quite common. And if you Google Shakespeare, okay, most of your hits will be Shakespeare the playwright. But if you Google things like the Shakespeare or a Shakespeare or Shakespeare's, you get all sorts of things. Shakespeare is actually used quite commonly as an eponym. Anyway, time is pressing, so I won't go into that. Notice that these are also internet examples from the word Manhattan. This works also with place names, not just people names, but Manhattan refers to the place Manhattan, the financial, district in New York. Okay, and notice that different uses of the word Manhattan can actually draw on different aspects of your encyclopedic knowledge of the place. So here, Singapore is described as the Manhattan of the East, referring to the financial center. But the next example, this is referring to a city in Yemen, which is the desert country in the Middle East. This ancient city, its tower-like structures rise out of the cliff and have given the city the nickname of the Manhattan of the desert. Now, this is not the city which is a financial center. It simply refers to the tall buildings, right? Just as you see Manhattan from the sea, from the ocean, with the big buildings rising up from the sea. So here in the desert, you see these big buildings arising out of the cliff. So here, to interpret this, you are actually drawing on another aspect of knowledge, what the place looks like, or rather, what it looks like in photographs that you see. Okay? And that would invoke the domains of the financial center and big buildings and so on. But many words invoke actually a typical sort of story, a typical sequence of events. So script will be used for a typical sequence of events, and these are important actually for understanding emotions, and quite a lot of work has been done on these. If you take an emotion concept like anger, to be angry, well, you might say that, well, to be angry is to be in a certain emotional condition. You are in a certain emotional state if you are angry. But there's more to anger than that, because anger is understood typically as part of a story. First of all, somebody has provoked you, somebody has annoyed you, somebody has said something or done something. Secondly, you respond badly, you become angry. And then the story continues. What do? Do you get your revenge on the other person? Do you then start shouting and screaming? Do you start hitting people? Or do you try to control things? So the notion of anger is then associated with a sort of typical sequence of events. And equally sadness, if you are sad, it's not just that you're in a certain state, but typically something has happened. And you feel sad as a consequence of something that has happened. Okay? So I say so these emotion words, which seem to refer to a state, in fact, they invoke as a domain, as their background knowledge, a kind of story, a typical sequence of events. And envy and jealousy are nice examples. And to understand those concepts, you have to imagine a kind of story that has happened. You see? Somebody has something that you want for envy. Okay. I want to finish. I think it's... yeah, I'll be able to finish this, I think. Okay, so scripts are a typical sequence of events. Now, I want to finish by talking about a concept which is actually which was introduced by George Lakoff, and which is actually very useful. The idea of the background knowledge against which you understand concepts is often idealized. That is, it may not correspond to reality. It may not correspond to reality. Now, we can take the bachelor example again. Bachelor we've defined as unmarried adult man. But then, if you take the case of a Roman Catholic priest, right? Now, Roman Catholic priests are not supposed to marry. Well, they are not married. They do not marry. Roman Catholic priests are single. They are not married. They may not marry. Can you therefore refer to a Roman Catholic priest as a bachelor? Well, yes and no. Yes, strictly speaking, yes, but not really. You wouldn't refer to the Pope as a bachelor, for example. In other words, it looks as if the word bachelor has prototype effects. There are the typical examples, and there are the marginal examples. Or consider the situation, consider a culture in which a man can have two wives. Right? Suppose he has only one, so he's allowed to have another one. Is he a bachelor? These are the marginal cases. So from one point of view, the word bachelor has a kind of prototype structure. There are good examples, there are the problematic examples. One way to deal with this is to say that, well, in fact, the notion of bachelor, in fact, is quite clear. And when you talk about bachelor as unmarried man, that is true. However, you understand the notion of bachelor against an idealized view of society, which may not correspond to facts, but the idealized view would be that everyone marries at more or less a certain period of time. Right? Okay, there are no Catholic priests. There are no homosexuals. There are no people living together without getting married. Right? So a kind of idealized society in which, at a certain point in your life, in your sort of 20s or whatever, certain people get married. And everybody does. That is the normal thing to do. Now, if you assume this idealized society, which does not correspond to reality, if you assume this idealized society, then you can indeed say a bachelor is a man who has not yet married. It works perfectly simple. And the prototype effects arise because the ideal does not fit reality. Okay? So the case of the Catholic priest or the Pope, that is problematic, not because you don't know what the word bachelor means. It's problematic because the idealized model does not fit the Pope, or the Pope does not fit the model. The model does not cover, Catholic priests who are not supposed to marry. And of course, there's an interesting contrast between bachelor and spinster. Spinster is the unmarried woman, but in English, in fact, spinster has rather negative associations. A woman would not be pleased to be called a spinster. It implies unattractive. Nobody wants her, basically. And again, these associations can probably be traced back to idealized cognitive models of marriage and marriage practices. Another example is to tell a lie. What does it mean to tell a lie? To say something that isn't true. But of course, if you think about it a moment, that is not, it's much more complicated than that. If you say to somebody, thank you for a most delightful evening, I really enjoyed myself, and you are actually bored, are you telling a lie? Well, yes and no. If you tell a joke, if you tell a story, the story has been invented, right? Are you telling a lie? Well, no. So if you tell a story, you are not actually, okay, if you have made up, if you invented a story, you're telling a joke, for example, you're not describing things that happened, you've made it up. So, in a sense, you are saying things that are not true. But this is not telling lies. Okay? The point is that telling a lie is understood against the kind of, well, the definition of lie is to say something that isn't true, would be understood against the kind of idealized model in which we communicate only for the purpose of giving information, which we believe to be true and which we believe will be helpful. Right? But there are many situations which are not covered by this idealized model. We use language to entertain, to amuse. We tell stories, we tell jokes. So this is not covered by this model of communication. We use language in order to be polite to people, right? To establish good social contacts with people, good social relations with people. And again, this is not covered by this model of language as communication. But if you accept the notion of language, we use language to communicate ideas for the benefit of people, then indeed telling a lie, would be to say something that is not true. Therefore, it is a bad thing. Therefore, the other person is being harmed and deceived, and so on. So, telling a lie presupposes this idealized model of communication. And the difficult case is like, are you telling a lie when you say, I had a most delightful evening with you this evening, and you are not, and you're really bored stiff. The problem, that case relates to the fact that not all situations actually are covered by the idealized model of communication. So a final comment here. So the idealized cognitive model was developed by Lakoff. Well, in fact, not by Lakoff. It was, well, yes, by Lakoff. But the Batchelor example came before him. What interests me, actually, is the idealized models we have of language itself. And I want to mention a few, or finish with a few comments on this. The dictionary plus grammar book model that I talked about yesterday, that is also, in fact, a sort of idealized model of language, which actually does not actually correspond to the facts of how language is used. It doesn't account for the idioms and so on and so forth. Another model of language is referred to here as the building block model. That is to say, words are like bricks, right? You build a wall by putting your bricks together. So you build your sentence by putting your words together. The words are like bricks. You put them together and you build up the whole structure. So that is a common model of of compositionality, in fact. A model of language which has been studied quite intensively is the so-called conduit model of language. I don't know whether you are familiar with this. A conduit is simply a way of a kind of tunnel to go from A to B along a channel. And the idea here is that, well, it's an idea of communication. I communicate to you. I have ideas in my head. Right? I put these ideas into words, and I send the words to you. You receive the words, you open them up, and you take out the ideas. Just like me sending a letter to you, I take the letter, I write the letter, I put it in the envelope, I send the envelope to you through the post, or whatever. You receive the envelope, open it up, take out the piece of paper, and you have my message. Right? So that is quite a common, that is actually quite an influential way of understanding communication. So words are containers for ideas. I put my ideas into words. I then send these to you through a conduit, to a channel. Here it is through sound, but I can also send them to you through a written message. I can send them to you through a telephone line. You receive the words, and you open them up, and you take out the content. Notice that quite a few expressions that we use to talk about communication are actually based on this metaphor. Put ideas into words. The content of a message I get through to you. Right? But of course, that model of language is actually quite deceptive and misleading in a way, because it sort of implies that what you get out of what I say is the same as what I put into it. Okay? And communication actually probably is not like that. It's not that you are getting out of what I say, what I put into it. You are trying to construct something out of what I say, trying to make sense of it. So the conduit model of communication, in fact, simplifies and actually distorts the actual process of communication, or understanding of the process of communication. So as I say, a topic that has interested me recently has been the models that we have of communication, the models that we have of language. And certainly amongst in Western culture, the conduit model is very, very dominant. And the dictionary plus grammar book model, I think, is also quite dominant. The one topic that would interest me, if anybody could inform me on this, are there typically Chinese or Eastern models of language which are perhaps different from the Western models? I don't know. A couple of observations on the basis of my conversations with students and so on. One thing I've noticed about Chinese and Japanese speakers is that there is a view that the real essence of a word is in fact the written character. That the essence of a word is not the pronunciation, it is the character. Which for me is very, very strange. I would not think of the essence of a word as its spelling. That is quite irrelevant. Is that an important aspect of your view of language? That the character, that the written form is more important than the spoken form. That the real essence of the word is the spoken, is the written form. No? Anyway, and another thing I've noticed, I don't know whether this would strike you as plausible. This is specifically with Chinese people, that the extent of language knowledge, your degree of proficiency in a language, would be measured in terms of how many words you know. Does that strike you as familiar? That, at this stage of learning a language, you know 1,000 words. Here you know 2,000 words. At the end of, this school year, you will know 5,000 words. Is that okay. That possibly is a typically Chinese metaphor of language, a model of language. Okay, these are, as I say, these idealized models of language, idealized cognitive models. We have them everywhere. We make sense of the world in terms of idealized cognitive models. Okay, they are cognitive in that they are beliefs, they are idealized in that they are simplified. They are simplified, and they may not actually correspond to reality. They are useful, but may not correspond to reality. Or they don't fit reality completely. Right? So to come back to the language proficiency thing, clearly it is an important aspect of proficiency, obviously is how many words you know. If you only know 500 words, then, you can't get very far. But obviously there is a lot more to it than simply how many words you know. Of course, it's a question of what you do with those words. And not just words, but idioms and collocations and phrases and all the rest of it. Okay, so I think I'll leave it there. This afternoon I'm talking about space. space. Not outer space, but prepositions, basically.